Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the next instalment of the GemCap Academy. It's my pleasure to introduce Esther Armstrong from White Marble, a firm that we're very close to. Twink, who some of you may know, is somebody I've known for a long, long time, and in fact lives about 2 villages over, actually, here in North Hertfordshire. Now, Esther may well be known to a number of you. I know she's definitely known to 2 of you today, and you'll know that she's the ex-news editor over at Portfolio Advisor, and has spent 6 years until recently at BNY, 2 of which were in New York, and tells me she created an award-winning communications team there. And today we're going to be talking about content, particularly around marketing and what's required. It's often it's something I discuss with fund managers a lot, and many fund managers fail to understand that content is vital for success of getting their message across. So hopefully today, Esther will give us some ideas of what we didn't realize you needed to know about content, and hopefully by the end of it we'll know a lot more. So over to you, Esther. I'm going to drop off camera for the benefit of everybody and to mute. Speak to you soon.
Thank you, Stuart. Let me just minimize you guys, not because I don't want to see your faces, but just so that I can see the slides effectively. I want to introduce myself because Stuart has already done that, and those kind of introductions can be quite tiresome when someone goes on about their credentials. So I will just move straight into the presentation. This is a story that came out last year, which I found particularly interesting as a former journalist myself, in that the Daily Telegraph was talking, well, it was leaked that the Daily Telegraph was planning to link their journalist pay with the popularity of their articles online. Now, this piece was featured in The Guardian, which is obviously a competitor to the Telegraph, but I wouldn't like to disparage my journalist peers in saying that they made this up. So I believe it is true. And it was leaked by journalists at the Telegraph. So they sent out the email in which this had been documented and talked about. The reason that I find it interesting, because you might say, what's this got to do with us? None of us are journalists anymore, is that it really shows, to my mind, the power of content. The fact that the Daily Telegraph is so kind of motivated to have their journalists create the type of content that people want to click on and read, that they are willing to remunerate them accordingly, is something that potentially in the past was unthinkable. You know, the key merits of journalism were to be kind of balanced, unbiased, all of those kinds of things. So that is shifting to be, it's more about how many people are reading your content and how long they're on there for. So I guess this is an illustration of the fact that whilst we might be more familiar with the phrase that time is money, nowadays data is currency, and everybody wants to know who you are, what your interests are, your disposable income, your stance on various topics, and whether you might have interacted with them as a business before. And this is all in kind of a mission so that they can target you more effectively in selling their goods and services. But because they can't just ask you those questions outright from the offset, which would be very obtrusive and quite offensive, the way that more companies are going about this now is through content. And the way that you interact with their content is their way of getting the data and insights about you, converting that into a currency for their business effectively, and then eventually hoping to make a sale because they'll be able to target you more effectively with their communications. And essentially this is all down to one innocuously named thing, which is cookies. Now, in the past, when I've tried to play this video, it hasn't necessarily shared the audio for the people on Zoom. So bear with me and I will play it and we'll see whether it works. I'm just going to take you to the bit that I find most entertaining. Now, if you didn't hear the audio there, then you're missing out, and I'll send the link afterwards. But my main point here is that cookies that are collected on websites and on the internet are used by your business's CRMs to create a picture of a client or a prospect. And the more that they can pull those cookies from different websites, and that might be from their own website or from third-party websites, the better a picture they can create of somebody in terms of what their kind of motivations are, the type of content they like to engage with, that kind of thing. And as an illustration of this in practice, I wanted to share with you a case study. And because we probably all get a little bit sick and tired of looking at financial services topics, I thought I would take a case study from outside of financial services, because it's fair to say that we are also usually a good 5 to 10 years behind other industries when it comes to marketing and content. So the business that I have used as a case study is Finister. They are a Cornwall-based business, and I first interacted with them on Instagram in December 2020. So when my first impressions of them, obviously these pictures are very beautiful, quite aspirational. They're UK based, they have good sustainability credentials. The clothes that they create are both quality and durable, but there's also this kind of idea of it being quite fuss free, that, it's not about a fashion or a fad. It's something that you will buy and own for a long time. And so it's aspirational, that lifestyle, the seaside lifestyle, aspirational, but not unreachable. So there was some targeted marketing to me, probably based on my kind of age and likes and the types of things that I was already following on Instagram. And it worked, because I went from one of the posts that they had sent to me onto their website. And once I landed there, the experience continued to be consistent with my initial experience. So not only do they reinforce their sustainability credentials, sustainability as standard since 2003, they have an entire tab on their website about sustainability. Here that you see the kind of declaration of cookies, but let's be honest, every single one of us press accept at this point, because we just want the annoying message to go away. I actually saw a meme about that where it was on Instagram or something, and they were saying, is there a button I can press to just accept all cookies for all time, because of the number of times a day that we all end up having to press those buttons. Now, obviously, it's there because of GDPR and regulation that came through on capturing the data of people, but it's still pretty annoying. So this website reinforces my first impressions about the brand. You still got that lovely seaside vista. That sustainability credential is backed up. So I browsed around for a bit. I signed up because they prompted me that if I signed up, I would get a 10% discount off my first purchase. And then I promptly forgot about it. Sorry, just moving on to the next slide. When it then comes to kind of continuing on this customer journey, Finister continues to do a good job. And that's because they've now got my email address. So I checked my emails and I'm reminded about them. Thank you for signing up, 10% off your next purchase. And then they keep drip feeding communications to me. They don't let me forget about it. So they send me another message saying, don't miss out, you still have 10% off. I don't engage with that one, but then they send me one that goes back to their sustainability credentials saying that they do things differently. I click through on that, obviously get kind of drawn back in, and lo and behold, I order my first item from them. You can see there that my shipment came out. So far, the buying cycle has gone from I interacted with them in December for the first time on Instagram. I land on their website. 31st of January is when I put my email address into the field. And then by the 3rd of February, I've ordered my first item from their website. And then I received the confirmation and a shipment email. So far, so good, so standard when it comes to e-commerce in particular. But it doesn't stop there. So their persistence pays off, essentially. One common complaint I hear when we work with asset managers is that they're worried that if they send too much content out, that people will unsubscribe and drop off their lists. And typically asset managers and advisors may have quite extensive lists of either legacy clients or people that they've worked with in the past that are no longer their client. And one of their biggest fears is this list shrinking. And I can see where they're coming from. You know, from their point of view, you want to think that you have as large an audience as possible. But in reality, I think if someone unsubscribes to the type of content that you're sending out to them, then were they ever really an engaged audience in the first place? So if they unsubscribe and they no longer receive your emails, then that's no bad thing, because they were kind of a silent prospect in the first place. So I thought I would just include the next screenshot of my inbox. Obviously, I don't solely get emails from Finister. I filtered it here to show just the Finister emails, but they continued to try and tantalize me. So, you know, they send a survey through saying, you know, you can get 10% off again. They say something about a free beanie with my next order. They send through a few more pieces on their sustainability and their values, which I don't necessarily engage with. Flash sale, that's always going to have a little bit of interaction. But ultimately, I didn't purchase anything else at this point. Although I do remember I thought about them in the summer because I was looking for some t-shirts. And so I thought about going on there because, again, I've been trying personally to buy fewer things but higher quality and make sure they have better sustainability credentials. But I didn't unsubscribe either. So even though they were emailing me sometimes 3 times in a week, I never unsubscribed from them because, you know, I still saw them as being aligned to me and my values, and I was interested in them as a company. And then eventually in December 2021, so a year after I'd first interacted with them as a business, I cracked when I saw a Peruvian alpaca jumper in the January sale. And apparently it was hand knitted and very sustainably produced. So it has become another wardrobe staple. In fact, it's the exact same style as the original cardigan that I bought in the February-March 2020. So I now have 2 of them, one in a gorgeous orange color and the other, you might be able to see just behind me on the chair, this kind of royal blue. And so you might be thinking, well, this is all well and good, but as asset managers or within the financial services industry, we don't have physical products to sell, and our sales cycle is generally far longer. There's a lack of understanding in the market about what we do, particularly, I suppose, if you're engaging with individuals and investors. If you're engaging with intermediaries, then, you know, it's then an intermediated market. So you're not selling directly to the end investor. But in my mind, this is why it's even more important to use the power of storytelling to break down those barriers. So an example from our industry that I rate is Rise ETF. And full disclosure, I consult both for White Marble and for Cornerstone Communicate, a PR agency, and Rise ETF is one of their clients. But I don't actually do any of the marketing content for them. So I actually just find that they have done a brilliant job with their own in-house marketer. And this is the landing page where if you go onto the funds tab, you immediately have these kind of visually engaging tabs. There's a uniformity of design and an application of brand, where Rise is the first word you see on each one. And I suppose this is another topic that is often asked about and talked about within the kind of content marketing element, is that balance between having product specific content versus content that is more research or insight led. And I think for a long time, maybe the scales were tipped too far in the other direction, where far too often it wasn't particularly evident when people landed on websites that you were an asset manager or a wealth manager, because maybe you'd gone so far to the thought leadership end of the spectrum that a lot of companies were almost trying to become like their own news website. But one thing I always said when I was at BMI Mellon was, whilst we might all have been journalists in the past, and so the way we write is hopefully audience led and engaging, we aren't journalists anymore. So we have to remember the kind of commercial element of why we're doing this job. So Rise do a great job here of having the funds kind of front and center, research and insight second. So the fact that the funds page kind of goes directly, once you click on each of these modules, through to the landing page for each of the respective funds is a great kind of concept from a customer journey point of view. And I suppose thematic investing has always been a good area for storytelling, but that doesn't mean that the execution has always been right. When you then go to their research and insights tab, I couldn't show you here, but the research and insights has a kind of sub menu or navigation with a drop down, and that has kind of these key evergreen content pieces, which are ETFs made simple, why thematic investing, a guide to ETF liquidity. So clearly they've had a think to themselves about what are some of the key barriers to people investing in ETFs, and that might be a lack of understanding. So they've created a piece called ETFs Made Simple. A lack of rationale for why they should be investing in themes in the first place. So they've written this piece, Why Thematic Investing. And then people might have read vague coverage in, say, the Financial Times about liquidity and potential liquidity problems in the ETF market. So they've created this guide to ETF liquidity. And so straight away, when someone lands on that research and insights tab, looks at the drop-down menu, three of the kind of key concerns that that investor might have are kind of ticked off right from the get-go. They then have a investment case for each of the funds that they run. So there's the investment case for sustainable food, the investment case for cannabis, the investment case for digital payments. And so for each of the thematic funds that they run, they have this same core piece of content. So that's all just when you drop down the menu from the research and insights on the kind of primary navigation up here. And then on the actual landing page for research and insights, they can use that for this more timely, topical, kind of up-to-date content that will change. But for that evergreen content, they can keep that up there, have that there permanently. And if it needs updated once a quarter, once every year, they will do so. But they've got that basic stable of content that's really addressing the key kind of concerns and fears that investors might have around their product base. So finally, I then would say kind of from the right-hand side, there's a really good use of menus there. They have the topics for each of the key funds, and then they have categories in terms of what the content type are. I would say that I don't know that people actually go to websites thinking, I really want to listen to a podcast today, or I'm particularly interested in viewing a video. So I don't always like it when in the main navigation, asset managers or advisors have a menu that drops down by content type. But I do think once someone's already engaging with the content on your landing page, there's no harm in adding this extra navigation, because at that point they may say, oh yeah, I want to watch a video about cannabis, for example. Who wouldn't want to watch a video about cannabis? So I've added this slide because it's a way that we try and illustrate the sheer amount of touch points that you might have with a client or a prospect. We split it up into digital and physical touch points. It's pretty scary looking, because you think, oh my goodness, do I have to be on top of and in control of every single one of these touch points? But in reality, you've got to think this is across your whole business. And for smaller businesses, this will be a bit convoluted and over the top. But for larger businesses, the kind of responsibility for this customer journey will be spread across the business. You can see here you've got PR, cold calls, which will be the sales function, personal meetings, again, most likely to be sales and distribution. And then in the digital sphere, much more marketing's domain, although sales and distribution will obviously use emails as and when it's appropriate. But again, this is there not to be scary and not to think, oh, we've got so much content to create and where on earth does one start? It's more to show the opportunity that there is to engage with clients and prospects, and the fact that there's so many different ways that you can do it. Another way that we like to think about content is through this, what we would call the sales and marketing funnel. It used to be called purely the sales funnel, but myself and my colleagues have made a concerted effort to call it sales and marketing funnel, because if you don't, that really kind of underappreciates and underrepresents the importance that marketing can play. So essentially, if you think of this as awareness being potentially the first time that someone has ever interacted with you as a brand, and loyalty being that they're a client and you want to keep them as a client. So you need to serve them with the type of content that will keep them interested. And I won't go through this exhaustively, but it can be a good exercise to sit down and think to yourself, well, do I have content for all of these stages of the customer journey? Do I have content at the awareness end of the funnel, where people who have never encountered my business, my brand, my product set or proposition might kind of learn something about me? But it's important to note that we wouldn't go straight into kind of a product push at this stage. This is more about brand building. So it's what you would traditionally think of as your thought leadership or blogs, infographics, something that's maybe thematic or opinion pieces to try and gain that kind of awareness in the market. This piece, the funnel that I've got here is aligned to more of a fund manager. But at the consideration stage, we've said asset class specific. If you were an advisor business, at the consideration stage, you might talk about the different services you offer. So from kind of retirement planning to estate planning, and kind of break it down into that way. And then once you get down to conversion, again, from an asset manager point of view, you're looking at more fund or strategy specific content. Whereas from a advisor point of view, you might be trying to create some rationale or reason that someone needs to go from knowing about who you are to why they want to work with you. So maybe that's an event of a kind of classic one would be the tax year end and preparing for that, or you know, perhaps a change in their life circumstances. So something that takes them from knowing who you are and what you do to, okay, but now I'm interested in working with you, and that trigger point. And then you get, once someone is a client, it's obviously very important to keep them informed and serviced. And so this falls into kind of the retention bucket. And traditionally in a fund manager, that'll come in the form of commentaries, kind of portfolio manager updates, transparency and openness if there's a bit of a performance blip, team changes, that kind of thing. Whereas with an advisor, it's obviously far more likely to be, this is what's been going on in the markets, here's how your portfolio has been affected, being proactive around that type of thing. Although I know obviously there will be kind of quarterly requirements that you service anyway from a client point of view. And then, as I mentioned, loyalty. And the great part about this is that if you get to the stage where you have these long-term clients that stick, then the content becomes a two-way street where perhaps they are happy to give you testimonials or endorsements that you can then use as case studies on your website to encourage future clients. And then another key point that we think about when engaging with asset managers and wealth managers around content is that trying to help people become aware of the fact that content should be aligned to client or potential client appetite. So I think it's fair to say that a lot of asset managers have their kind of, they create content at this end of the scale. So they maybe start with a white paper in mind or some kind of long read, pieces that we would call a hero piece of content, because generally a lot of time and effort goes into them. And that's all good and well, but not every single person has got 30 minutes or more to sit and wade through your 12-page white paper that you spent 3 months preparing. Because let's be honest, once someone has written the piece, it still needs to be edited, designed, re-edited potentially, signed off through compliance. There tends to be a lot of stages to that workflow process that gets you to this piece of hero content. And yet, even though all of that work has gone into this, the reality is if you send out a white paper on LinkedIn or another kind of email kind of reach out, are you likely to get that much engagement, particularly if people are inundated, which we know a lot of our clients and prospects are, with the same types of materials for many other asset managers or many other wealth managers? So what we try and say is, whilst the creation of this content is no bad thing, your prospect or your client is likely to start their journey at the opposite end of the spectrum. So where you might be preparing a 3-course meal for them, they're actually only hungry for a couple of tapas. So what you need to do is use that hero piece of content, break it down into much more manageable chunks. So whether that's an infographic, maybe some video snippets or blogs, and then, you know, progressively you can use a bit more detail, a bit more length, and if they deem it interesting enough, then maybe they'll want to read the full piece. But that doesn't mean that you hit them with that right from the get-go. Market reactions we put in this section because they're a bit of a kind of group unto themselves, in the sense that they're almost bread and butter for a lot of asset managers. And that's not to say not to do them. You could say that they're a baseline that people expect from an asset manager. But what I would say is, if you can't get market reactions out into it in a timely fashion, i.e. the Fed raises interest rates, you have a piece ready that day, if not the next, then you probably shouldn't be doing them. I also find that a lot of market reactions are exceedingly retrospective. So people will will do a month in review, a quarter in review. And I always find that a bit bizarre because people have just lived through that month or lived through that quarter. So I don't really see the value it necessarily adds to remind them of everything that just happened. So happy to have someone challenge me on that, but I do think that it's slightly overrated. So if people are doing market reactions, I would recommend that they're timely, short, and not overly retrospective, and try and put something into context as to, okay, but what does this mean? And so what, essentially, not just retelling the story, because people can go on the BBC or the FT if they want to hear in kind of real time what is going on in the economy. And then just as a kind of focuser around making content work for you, this is some of the areas that we try and encourage clients to really think about when it comes to creating meaningful and worthwhile content. So what's the purpose of that content? Why are you doing it? Is it helping you push towards broader business goals that you have? And again, this is something that I always say to take people right back to the drawing board, which is, yeah, that's great if you want to write about that bit of content because that particular fund manager or that particular relationship manager thinks that it's something interesting to say. But is it going to come back to what your business priorities are? So if your business priorities are raising money into the UK Equity Income Fund, then is a story about UK growth really actually achieving what you need it to achieve? So it's really about questioning and being robust enough to think, does this piece of content do what we need it to do in order to progress our business strategy? And if it doesn't, then that's not to say not to write it at all, but because there's always exceptions to every rule, and it can become a bit rigid if you never write something just because you think it will gain traction in the marketplace. But there's one kind of famous marketer that refers to it as the content crap trap, which is basically that there is so much content in the world right now, and it's clearly not going to reduce in volume. So if you're adding more content to the internet, then it should really be aligned with what it is that you're trying to achieve. From a planning point of view, is there a particular objective of the piece or a key performance indicator? And do you know how you're going to measure that? And whether you'll measure how it's a success? Who in your business do you need help with or from in order to create this piece of content, and how can you leverage it? So again, not just thinking of one medium or one distribution method at the beginning. A lot of people will come to us and say, we want to create a white paper. And you say, okay, well, why? What's your objective? And then they'll say that their objective is to create awareness about a particular capability or skill that they have. And so we say, okay, but a white paper is not necessarily the best way of doing that. So instead of starting with what you believe is the best format, maybe go back to, okay, what am I trying to achieve here? And then think to yourself, well, what's the best format for doing that? And it might be that it's not one format. It might be that you want to use it for multiple different channels and in content types. Then thinking about kind of the messaging and the positioning element of it. What is your stance? Is there anything unique about your position? Again, if there's not, is it worth creating? Do you have a tone as a business? I think, again, tone of voice is something that people will sometimes agonize over, and I don't think it's necessary for a business to have a very distinct tone of voice, especially if you have different people creating pieces of content. It can be pretty difficult to kind of make them all very uniform. And then there's also the element that maybe you have personalities within your business that you want to highlight, and that's part of the people of your business is something that you believe is worth elevating. And so kind of making everything uniform in that sense would take away from that. But from a branding perspective, I do think it's important. So you see the question there, does this look like a piece from our company? You saw on the Rise website there that they had a very distinct look and feel. And so I think it's pretty obvious when you see a piece from them. And then distribution, we always think about at the outset as well. Where is it going? Is it going on LinkedIn? Is it going out via email? Is it going to be a actual paper published piece? And if it's going to be all three of these things, how can I create it in a way up front that means that I'm being as efficient as possible? So thinking about that workflow where whoever's putting the content together thinks about that distribution from the get-go. Otherwise, what you can end up with is someone creates a piece of content, then it goes through the various processes of being edited, being signed off, being complied, and then a month down the line, someone decides, oh, actually, I'd really love to use this on LinkedIn, but there's no LinkedIn kind of teaser or introduction that's been written. Now, sometimes you can just take the headline of the piece of content and use that, so great. But if there's not something usable or effective, then what often happens is people say, okay, we now have to put this LinkedIn teaser through compliance, and the whole process starts again. So to save kind of time and energy, it can be really helpful to think up front, these are the different places that we want to use this piece of content, and so let's do that at stage one, and therefore it's ready and waiting to go should we decide to use it in different channels. If it's time sensitive, then you have to be willing and ready to push it through and have the kind of workflow that can get it to the right place at the right time. Otherwise, again, there's no real point in doing it, because if you come out with something time sensitive late, then it does more damage, I would say, than it does benefit. And then think about who else in your business could use it. Some content will be more of a sales enablement tool, so it might go on the website, but might also be sent to the sales team so that they can use it as a bit of a foot in the door to try and have conversations with prospects. If you have a PR team, then they can be a great way to get that content further afield, because they might be able to kind of place it with a certain publication. Or journalists might find the idea very interesting and want to then interview your subject matter expert about it. So thinking about it very holistically, for me, it's not about how much content you produce. It's producing content that's very relevant to what your business wants to achieve, and then making the most of it. And then that final step of analysis is important too, because if something didn't work, then why didn't it work? Did it take too long to create, and did that then take away from the effectiveness of the message? Were there too many people involved in the editing process, and that took out kind of all of the charm and character of the piece? Did it meet the goal, and what have you learned from it? And then you can use that to inform the next piece of content you create. And again, I would say I've gone through a bit of a journey on this. I'm sorry, I hate that phrase of going through a journey. My thinking has evolved on this in terms of when I first went in-house at BNY Mellon from being a journalist, the idea of having an editorial board or an editorial calendar sickened me. And I thought, oh God, there's nothing worse than having something that is almost over manufactured. But as time went on, I did start to think to myself that, again, from a commercial content marketing point of view, it's not about your kind of pet projects and writing about things that you think are interesting or enjoyable. Although if there are topics like that that align with your business goals, then great. it's really about helping the business towards their meeting those goals and helping evolve the business strategy. So in that sense, if you are a larger business, then having an editorial board is no bad thing. And on that board, you might have someone from sales, someone from product, people from some different markets, so not just your home market, because otherwise you can get yourself into a situation where you're only creating content for one of your kind of markets, so say the UK, and then your channel marketer in France or in Italy are thinking, this is useless to me. So trying to broaden out the spectrum of voices who have an input into that content as well, making sure that you have pieces that, as I mentioned before, kind of hit all of those different stages of the funnel. But if you're a smaller business and you're, a wealth manager, an advisor, you don't have a big marketing team, and you think all of this sounds exceedingly onerous from a time and resource point of view, then I suppose my number one tip there would be prioritizing. So again, if we go back to that Rise example, they had the, what is an ETF, concerns about liquidity, and why thematic investing. And those three key pieces of content are pieces of content that can be written once and used again and again and again. So it's about sitting down and thinking, who are the different audiences that I'm trying to appeal to? What are the key concerns or motivators that they might have to want to work with my business? And how do I create those core pieces of content that will work for me again and again? And then once you have those, you might then think, okay, I do have time to write a blog a month or every 2 weeks. And that's something that I think I can put out for free on LinkedIn to my network. And that's going to help incrementally build me brand recognition as well. But if you don't, then just get that evergreen content ready and working for you, because that's the most important content you could ever write. And then finally, I just wanted to show an example of, if we talk about these hero pieces of content. So this is a client that we worked with in the US who used to have a lot of these white papers, or because of the brand, blue papers. And this was something that they were very kind of adept at in terms of, a process that they had done time and time again. And more often than not, it was actually the portfolio managers that were writing these pieces. And our main role there was to say, look, there's nothing wrong with this content that you're putting together, but let's get all of this out of it. So we broke it down into different blogs, landing pages. We put it out on LinkedIn. We made infographics, which again could be used as social posts. We had a video of the author kind of talking about some of the key takeaways from the piece. And because of that, they got so much more engagement and use of that piece than they would if it had just sat as a dusty PDF on their website that not a lot of people were visiting. So I will stop there. I'm aware that's been a pretty whistle-stop tour of all things content, and that depending on which business and which segment you work for, it'll be kind of more or less relevant to you. So yeah, I will stop sharing and let people ask questions if they want to.
A big thank you to Esther for your time. Very interesting. A lot of what you said to me resonated massively, and it's something I constantly say to managers and marketing people. Content is something really, really important. Get it right. Break it down into small bite-sized bits. People's level of interest these days lasts for seconds, not minutes and hours, sadly. So get it short and sweet. On that note, thank you to everybody, and we wish you a great afternoon, and we'll see you next time for the GemCap Academy. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye now.